Thank you all. And I promise lunch is coming shortly where we can have plenty of time for conversation and moving around. But I think what Tyrone set us up for is and his takeaway message is such a nice segue into our opening plenary, which is beyond the money. We're going to be talking in this session about access to quality, affordable housing and how we think about long-term housing solutions and long-term housing sustainability. And I'm sure you heard in the opening comments, both from Bill and from the governor, that we are really looking at an unprecedented inflow of funds for housing. But what we're going to talk about today is not about the money. It's not about how we're going to spend that money. We are going to talk about the policies, programs, and practices that make up the housing landscape, but also create context for what housing looks like. And so we have a wonderful group of panelists who are going to help create context for us to think about housing in all the sessions as we go forward. So we are hoping that after this session, everyone will sort of gain an understanding and awareness of what policy tools, what community engagement practices, and what programs exist that we can leverage to make sure that we are building high quality, accessible, long-term, sustainable, affordable housing. And we're going to look at what policies and tools and practices exist in Nevada that we can leverage and use as opportunities to create that vision. And we're also going to hear about policies and practices from outside Nevada that we can consider hopefully becoming advocates for in our own community. And so the way our panel is going to work, we are going to have each of our panelists present for about 10 or 15 minutes, an overview of what they work on and what their organization does. And then we're going to spend most of the time in discussion, and we'll take questions from you and from all of the audience who is virtual, and we will have a really robust discussion. And I'm really pleased to introduce our panelists. We have such a wonderful cross-section of experts today. So joining us, we have David Huaman from Enterprise Community Partners, who's going to be virtual. The rest of our panelists are here with us. We have Jean Diaz from St. Joseph Community Land Trust. We have Graciela Castillo-Krings from Sacramento Advocates, and we have Chris Conklin from Unite Us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David from Enterprise, who's going to give us an overview of the work that they've done in Nevada and an overview of policy tools that are available to us.
Thank you so much, Elaine. Can everybody hear me all right? Seeing a lot of thumbs up in the crowd. Awesome. So I think I did prepare a slide deck. So I just want to make sure everyone can see that before I jump in. As Elaine mentioned, I'll be reviewing some of the housing policies that are available in Nevada, but as well as an overview of Enterprise and the organization and the work that we've done in Nevada. So jumping on to the first slide, just an overview of who we are. Enterprise Community Partners is a national nonprofit with a mission to make home and community places of pride, power, belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility. We have three main goals, which is looking at increasing housing supply, advancing racial equity, and building resilience and upward mobility. We're an end-to-end housing organization that's focused on solutions, capital, and development. And so I'm within the solutions arm of Enterprise Community Partners within Enterprise Advisors. And on the next slide, I'm a part of the Equitable Housing Solutions team. Sorry, it seems like it would be 2 slides back. Thank you. And so the Equitable Housing Solutions team, formerly known as the Housing Strategies and Implementation team, our approach looks to make connections to other local efforts, incorporate place-based approaches, build on existing community capacity, align with state level context, work collaboratively with project partners, and develop actionable items as well as approaches while embedding racial equity in projects and recommendations. The Housing Strategy Implementation team has had the opportunity to work in Nevada in the past with Ann Jordan and Chris Kizzy leading the Truckee Meadows Regional Strategy for Housing Affordability, and we pride ourselves in being key partners in the development of that. They're still within Enterprise Advisors, but just playing different roles. And more recently, we've had the opportunity to work alongside with Christine around the equitable recovery framework from last year's conference and some of the ARPA recommendations that were released over the summer. And so I wanted to pivot into some of the housing policies that exist within Nevada as we move forward to the next slide, and really cover some of the high level policies, as Elaine mentioned, what exists currently, how it's being implemented in Nevada, and what are some of the best practices across the nation that could be implemented in Nevada and bring it a little forward and bringing some more housing solutions to those in most need. So the 8 housing policies that I'll be reviewing, which is seen on this slide, the affordable housing element in housing planning, how this can address housing as it brings strategic planning and catalytic investment. The second one being density bonus, which can promote affordable housing developments. The third being community land trust, which looks to improve and diversify different pathways to home ownership. The fourth, supportive transitional housing pilot programs, which are innovative housing solutions for those in most need and really tailoring to the supportive services that they need. Impact fees can be a new way to promote affordable housing developments as well as close the feasibility gap, financial gap. Incentives for trans-oriented development looks to create greater linkage between affordable housing and transportation investments, as well as build other cross-sector collaborations across the board. The seventh being the tax incremental financing, which can promote preservation, revitalization, and affordable housing developments in specified districts. And the last policy I wanted to go over is inclusionary zoning, which creates affordable housing or new funding opportunities for affordable housing. And so I'll go over these on a high level, and the other panelists will go into detail on a few of them. So first, looking at the affordable housing elements in the master plan. In the next slide, you'll see that state legislation requires certain counties to meet a population threshold to carry out the housing plan itself. They're allowed to implement a wide range of tools that are listed here. Some of them will be covered in the overview that I just went through. And I think one way that we've seen this move forward is the capacity and technical support that jurisdictions need to see these tools really reach a lasting impact. In California, for their housing element, they host webinars. They provide templates as well as need assessment tools to target specific populations, tailoring to those needs. And I think when you identify the needs of the community that you're working with, you're able to elevate them and align them with some of the strategies or tools that are available to address those needs in a greater extent. The next policy tool I wanted to review is the density bonus. So density bonus is an incentive-based tool that can be leveraged by local entities, allowing developers to build higher density in exchange for financial commitments or accomplish policy goals. This tool works best in market rate construction areas, and it is a wonderful tool that is allowed to promote mixed income communities. And so some best practices that we've seen with density bonuses is that it can be targeted for specific revitalization areas. We've seen it as a common offset for mandatory or incentive-based inclusionary zoning policies. We've seen strong linkage between density with transportation and land use. And then the general outreach and education to generate support for the appropriate densities in the right locations. Not only letting the developer be informed of the options that are available for them at the table, but also getting feedback from the community on where they see there's the need for density, and also tailoring it to those in most need. The next policy tool is community land trust, which really is based on the city or jurisdiction's ability to donate public land to a nonprofit community-based organization, such as a CLT, which can ensure community stewardship of land and primarily used for long-term housing affordability through lease to purchase options, shared equity models, as well as deed restricted equity models. So an example of this is we saw the city of Reno donate lands in Golden Valley to the local community housing land trust and really provide homeownership opportunities for those in the 80% area median income or below. And so some best practices that we've seen across the nation around CLTs is not only local jurisdictions allocating local funds, but federal funds to prioritize projects around CLTs. fund different homeownership education and financial counseling programs. Navigating the homeownership process and the first-time homebuyer process can be daunting, and sometimes it might need tailoring to address some of the language barriers or cultural barriers, or provided in the appropriate median. And lastly, there's a need for long-lasting cross-sector partnerships. So not only will you need land use attorneys, city or county officials on board, but you can also have the community engaged to see what kind of homes or homeowner options are needed to help diversify the market as well. The next policy is supportive transitional housing pilot programs. This provides supportive services and capital assistance to those in most need while keeping them housed. And so these types of programs are very tailored to the population they're trying to address, as well as the homeownership model type that's used. Hope Springs is a wonderful example, which is a transitional rehabilitation program that allows for temporary housing for those folks that meet those needs in tiny homes. For best practices, we've seen, as I mentioned, allocation or prioritization of certain state funds towards permanent supportive housing. In some state funds, they prioritize their other affordable housing trust fund, a certain percentage to support these types of efforts. One area we've seen this being restricted is in zoning. A lot of times zoning that doesn't support group living facilities or have definitions around families can make it challenging for these types of pilot programs to be built. And so by addressing some of those challenges, it can be more feasible and more realistic to see more and more of these projects upcome. The next policy is around impact fees. In Nevada, qualifying jurisdictions are able to reduce or waive impact fees, and that could be one way to reduce the cost of developing affordable housing and really achieve some of the affordability objectives. We saw this in Clark County. Another practice we've seen people use impact fees is use it to foster affordable housing development in areas with high performing school or access to transit. So really combining the two sectors and addressing multiple outcomes. So really developing a shared outcome between school, education, housing, and transportation. We've also seen it as an alternative to inclusionary housing programs or a housing development impact fee on any type of new residential development, and using those funds to fund other affordable housing projects in those communities where it's being used. The next state policy is incentives for trans-oriented development. TODs are defined as compact mixed-use development planned around transitional hubs and accessibility to walkable neighborhoods. The City of Parks released their TOD in 2009, which identified areas that already need higher density. One way to build some union between TOD plans and affordable housing is looking at joint development between land owned by transit and other agencies such as school districts, and seeing where affordability can also be met within them as well. We've seen combined employed assistance housing programs as well, where local school districts have donated land to developers to build affordable housing for the teachers that are working in those schools as well. The tax incremental financing tool is districts that can catalyze housing productions in areas that are leveraging state existing housing programs and policies, as well as financial tools. Currently, the state legislation allows local governments to develop redevelopment agencies and redevelopment areas that use TIFs for the purpose of redevelopment, as well as the elimination of blight areas. Across the country, we've seen some best practices around tying affordability requirements to development in a TIF district. We've also seen the creation of affordable housing TIF districts established to support the creation of and financing of new affordable homes. And then there are certain restrictions that the state can put to limit the percentage of land which municipalities can be used to designate as a TIF district area. So you can add some regulation to this tool and really tailor it to address some of those housing needs that are rising on a state level. The last tool I wanted to cover is inclusionary zoning, which defined by the state legislation is zoning that requires or provides incentives to a developer who builds off residential dwelling units to a certain percentage of affordable housing. We see this tool work best when deployed strategically in areas through a region where it's economically feasible, where we're seeing a lot of market rate development, as well as a tool to promote inclusivity in mixed income communities. In terms of best practices on how this tool has been successfully implemented, setting design and location standards between those market rate units as well as affordable units, a set of alternatives such as pay in lieu fees, which can be used to fund other affordable housing developments or affordable housing trust fund and address a wide range of affordable housing issues. A set of incentives such as density bonuses or tax abatements, which are commonly used. And lastly, but probably one of the most important ones is the engagement and education for developers and publics around the developmental options and the trade-offs needed. And so really building that support early on, as well as that understanding. And so I want to thank you all for this time, and I'll pass it back to Elaine to pass it to who's next.
Thank you, David. Next up, we're going to have Jean talk about community land trusts.
Everybody hear me okay? So how many times have we heard the word community already today, right? I mean, it's just so important to understand the concept of community and all that we do to provide housing. Slide, please. While it's being loaded, I am the executive director for the St. Joseph Community Land Trust. We are, I think, are the only bi-state community land trust that exists. We serve both Nevada and California in the Tahoe Basin. So the slide is up, so we can move ahead, please. So what is a community land trust? David touched on it a little bit, but David focused on the ownership piece. And that is what I think most people think of when they think about community land trust. It's the ownership piece of it, where the community land trust retains ownership of the land and would sell a house to an income qualified household subject to a 99-year ground lease. But community land trusts are more than that. Excuse me, as we'll see. So what is a community land trust? A community land trust, like I said, can be many things, and they can be structured in many different ways. For example, St. Joseph Community Land Trust is an independent 501c3 nonprofit corporation. Here in Nevada, we also have the Community Foundation of Northern Nevada. We have Nick and Chris here. That is a subsidiary created by the Community Foundation. It's another way of structuring a community land trust. Community land trust can also be a subsidiary of another nonprofit. Habitats and community land trusts are doing a lot of work together. So a habitat can create a subsidiary community land trust, for example. It can be created by a governmental entity. The Irvine Community Land Trust was created by the city of Irvine. So community land trusts can be generated in many, many different ways, depending on the community. Again. It's a structure that allows the land to be held in trust. You know, as David pointed out, usually the community land trust retains ownership of the land to ensure that stewardship into the future. It may or may not be a membership organization. St. Joseph Community Land Trust is a membership organization. San Diego Community Land Trust, where I came from, was not. Irvine Community Land Trust is not. So again, they can be created in very different ways. One of the important things is that the community land trust, the ownership model, allows the homeowner to accumulate wealth, even though it's affordable, even though there are resale restrictions that we'll talk about in the ground lease, the homeowner can accumulate wealth. Next slide, please. Excuse me. Typically, as I mentioned, the community land trust retains ownership of the land, and through a 99-year ground lease, controls what happens to that property over time. That ground lease contains resale provisions to ensure that that home retains its affordability to serve several generations of households. It's also a way to control how the property is used. For example, in Lake Tahoe, you're probably aware that there's a huge problem with vacation rentals and people just buying houses and they sit vacant for 9 months out of the year. The community land trust ground lease can require that it's a permanent residence only, that it can't be used to be rented out or a vacation home. Community land trust, as we'll see, can support many different activities beyond home ownership. Rental and ownership certainly are the key fundamental housing pieces of it, but they can also provide small business support, workforce housing programs, for example, community facilities and services. Our Sugar Pine Village project in South Lake Tahoe will include an affordable childcare facility and a community service hub above the childcare facility, in addition to 248 units of low-income affordable housing, workforce housing. And as we'll see also, community land trust can provide housing-related supportive services. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to go through this slide pretty quickly. One of the things I want to point out is the ladder on the left-hand side of the slide is the housing ladder. I don't know if you guys have seen this meme before, but housing can go from homelessness to full market rate. And in between, there's a lot of steps that can happen. I think Tyrone's presentation this morning, oftentimes when I use this, we think about the trajectory is always going up, right? We start out low income, maybe we rent. When we get enough wealth, we buy a house, and we think of it as a one-way street. But as Tyrone's story points out, it's not always a one-way street. A lot of stuff can happen, and you slip down those housing rungs. So we think it's important to provide a range of housing options in a housing program for the community. And in that box, the typical area that community land trusts work in is maybe just above homelessness to just below market rate. So for example, St. Joseph, we cover from 30% AMI to 120% AMI through our programs. So David talked about expand affordable ownership housing. That's certainly the core. That's the basic community land trust model. Next slide, please. We also expand affordable ownership, rental housing, rental workforce housing, like our Sugar Pine Village project. And that's generally the 30% to 80% of AMI area. Next slide. We also community land trust can preserve existing affordable housing. We have the Tahoe program where we will provide financial assistance to an income qualified family to purchase an existing house, to put that into the affordable housing stock and preserve it into the future. Next. And also acquisition rehab is part of preserving existing housing that community land trusts can perform. Next. Supportive housing programs. In a couple of slides, I'll show you some of the supportive housing programs that we do. It's not just housing. Next. ADUs and JDUs, we talked a little bit as different policies, and one of the hot topics right now is expanding accessory dwelling units or junior accessory development units. There are community land trusts that exist that provide technical assistance to homeowners that are creating ADUs or JDUs to expand affordable housing opportunities. Next. And also, David ended his with talking about inclusionary housing. A lot of times developers don't like inclusionary housing. They say it's not our business to find income qualified people and manage those units. And community cities sometimes find it difficult to staff inclusionary housing programs and the management of those programs. Well, community land trusts do exist. In fact, the community land trust in Sonoma, all they do is take inclusionary housing units that are developed, put them in the community land trust portfolio, and steward those units. So, and it'll come back a little bit later in one of the other slides. Next. One of the benefits, excuse me, of the community land trust model is stewardship. It's not like a typical developer where we develop it and we're off. Through that 99-year ground lease, we're there to provide support. One of the best measurements of the benefit of that stewardship, excuse me, is how community land trust mortgages have performed through stress. We went through a terrible housing crisis a few years back. The benefit of having A group like the Grounded Solutions Network, which is an umbrella group for shared equity programs, they did a study the fourth quarter of 2010, sort of in the midst of the housing crisis, how community land trust mortgages performed compared to other mortgages. And community land trusts barely show up. This chart shows serious delinquencies and foreclosures in process. That dark area at the very bottom are community land trust portfolios, outperforming by a wide margin even prime mortgages. Key benefit of that stewardship that comes along with the community land trust. Next. So a lot of what we're going to talk about in this conference is what does it take to provide a comprehensive housing program for a community. Well, it takes more than a village, to use sort of a trite saying. For example, public agencies. It's important that public agencies understand their role in establishing supportive policies. David talked about some of those: fee reductions, deferrals, inclusionary housing programs, density bonuses, ADU programs. Also providing resources to help organizations like community land trusts. Surplus land, our Riverside project, 3 ownership projects, homes in South Lake Tahoe is on land that the city of South Lake Tahoe is deeding to us for $1, which is a big help. Home buyer assistance programs and other subsidies. Next. The permanence of the community land trust model. You know, we're talking about subsidies here and just previous to this. The permanence of the community land trust model, the fact that it's a 99-year ground lease, and every time it gets resold, it's a new 99-year ground lease, that exceeds well beyond most deed restricted programs. So the permanence of the community land trust model is, it lends itself to a very efficient use of subsidy retention. Very important, I think, when a community is looking at programs. Next. Funding sources. We talked about the need to sustain an organization here. Sponsoring organizations such as the government entity, foundations, if they created the community land trust, or a parent nonprofit. Where are they going to get the resources to start up and to sustain? Next. Financial institutions are very important to help a community land trust perform its functions. Banks benefit from the Community Reinvestment Act, very important sources of funding for community land trusts. Community development financial institutions, excuse me, for project financing. RCAC here in Nevada is providing our construction financing for our Riverside project. Very important source of project financing. Grants, foundations, corporate and individual donors are also a very important part of funding and sustaining a community land trust organization. Next. Collaborations with for-profit developers. Now, I have to say there's some in the community land trust movement that abhor the idea of partnering with a for-profit developer. However, a lot of large projects like our Sugar Pine project and our Sierra Garden project, large multifamily rental projects require excuse me, expertise and resources that a for-profit developer can bring. Next. However, the community land trust as a partner can provide community oversight and control to be sure that that project retains its charitable housing purpose. And also our participation, for example, in our projects with for-profit developers, we don't have a huge financial risk up front. However, we get a share of the developer fee and we get a share of the asset management fees that help provide and expand our other programs. So a lot of dual benefits there. Next. Again, inclusionary housing. I mentioned that developers oftentimes say, this is not our bailiwick. We don't like inclusionary housing. We don't know how to manage those units. Next slide. So the community land trust can provide stewardship for those units. The community land trust can take those units being provided, put them in the community land trust portfolio, find the income qualified households, can provide the monitoring and the reporting to the municipality that is creating that program. So it's really a win-win in terms of the community land trust providing those two very important benefits for an inclusionary housing program. And also the resale process. So a lot of the problems with inclusionary housing is sometimes these units get lost to the market because there isn't proper monitoring. But again, with the community land trust, we monitor that resale process and ensure that that next home goes to another income qualified household with a new 99-year ground lease. Next. And also collaborations with other nonprofits. They can also bring some benefits. A good example, next slide, please. San Diego Community Land Trust and the San Diego Habitat affiliate work together to do the National City Project. And it really combined the best of the community land trust model in terms of long-term stewardship into the future and the habitat model in terms of getting those houses built efficiently using the habitat model. Next. So here's St. Joseph Community Land Trust. No, you know, the great thing about the Community Land Trust is its flexibility. And it really needs to be tailored to the specific needs of a particular community. There probably is no other community land trust that has this package of programs and projects. So we do ownership homes. We create new homes. We also have our Tahoe program, which is to preserve existing homes in an affordable way. We expand rental low-income workforce housing. I talked about that. We have a motel to home program. In the Tahoe Basin, there was a real problem where a lot of the workforce couldn't afford a regular apartment. They were living in motels with school-age children. It's not a great way to raise a child. So we developed the motel to home program where we provide interest-free loans to an income qualified family that has school-age children so that they can come up with first month's rent and security deposit to move into an apartment. We talked about supportive programs. We have an emergency loan program, which we created as a loan program. These are revolving loans, so we can keep that money churning and provide the same funds over and over. But recently, we actually expanded that. You know, with the Caldor fire, the entire city of South Lake Tahoe and surrounding area was evacuated. And our Sierra Garden tenants, excuse me, these are Section 8 low-income tenants. We actually, our board agreed to convert the emergency loan program funds that we had to provide grants to our Sierra Garden tenants that were evacuated. They were all evacuated. And we helped about 22 families that were primarily single family parents or disabled people with some grants. These were converted to grants to help them deal with the costs of the evacuation. Financial literacy and homeownership. We think that is a critical part of becoming a homeowner and accumulating wealth. So we actually have programs for homebuyer assistance and financial literacy. And environmental stewardship is that just reflects our board's belief that whatever we do needs to be environmentally sensitive. Next slide, please. So on the left side, there is just some of our current projects. We have the Sugar Pine Village, 248 units, 1, 2, and 3 bedroom and studio. That's low income workforce housing. We also have 3 moderate income ownership homes that we're developing in South Lake Tahoe. Next. So hopefully you're sold. Hopefully you guys want to do a community land trust now. So what do? Well, some of the key issues, if you think about what I've talked about, some of the things you need to think about for your community is who are the stakeholders, who are the parties that would be interested in creating and sustaining a community land trust for our community. What is the service area? Community land trust can be very small, targeted, neighborhood focused. They can be a large geographic area. For example, St. Joseph, we have the entire Tahoe Basin covering both the California and Nevada pieces. You really need to think about that. That's a very important dimension. They can be membership or not. And that can have different benefits or drawbacks depending on the community. Can be standalone or an affiliate, as we talked about the different forms of creation. Funding sources, you need to think about where you're going to get money to create and to sustain the organization. And also, critically, what are the programs and the projects that the community that you're thinking about creating a community land trust in wants? That's the flexibility of this model. It can be tailored to what the community needs and wants. Next. So hopefully this is a highlight. This is an appetizer, hopefully. Maybe if you guys want to follow up and get a deeper dive into this, maybe next conference we can do a breakout session so we can spend a lot of time doing a deep dive just on community land trust. But here are some resources for you if you want to get some more information in the meantime. The top is some research that you can do online, different organizations that can help. And there's some consultants that exist if you really are serious about a startup community land trust. It's important, I think, to get some good advice in doing that. And there are 3 consultants there that I've included that have a great deal of experience in helping organizations get off the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Next, we're going to hear from Graciela.
Good morning, everybody. Can we prepare the slide deck, please? Hi, my name is Graciela Castillo-Krings, and I am a lobbyist. I know, bad word, right? I actually have the pleasure of representing California YIMBY, and that means yes in my backyard. And it's a movement that has started in California and has actually led to a lot of really interesting and progressive policy that has actually moved the ball forward when it comes to housing. And just to kind of give you a little quick preview of California and some of the issues, they're not very different from Nevada. As I'm hearing some of the other speakers talk, there's a lot of similarities. So just a couple of things though. Next. So one of the things that has been very clear in California is we basically, it's a demand and supply problem. We have not been building enough. Next slide, please. We have not been building enough, and it hasn't happened overnight. It's happened over decades. So just to give you a quick overview, annually, California should be producing about 180,000 units. On our best year, maybe we hit about 100,000 units, not enough. We basically the estimated need goes from anywhere from 2.5 to 3.5 million units that we're missing. And the reality is, it's not going to happen overnight. We're trying to figure out how to kind of make sure that we're building in a way that is reasonable and thoughtful. One of the other things that we have figured out is that we have land use planning and regulations that create barriers to development. And I will get into that a little more later. And then when we look at where the building is happening, we really are concentrating a lot of development in areas that are environmentally and social economically disadvantaged, which is creating further problems from a societal standpoint. And that there's an imbalance right now that is happening because the coast, where a lot of our job centers are really unsustainable when it comes to affordability. No one can live there. Just to give you an example, the average price of a home in California is about $800,000. Who has that kind of money? And so what has happened is you end up having people that cannot afford the coast where the jobs are and moving inland, right? So they're moving into areas of the state that, one, don't have as many resources, don't have jobs. The other thing is there's a lot of encroachment into wildfire areas. So that's the next big issue. And part of the other thing that we've come to realize is we don't have a sustainable amount of funding that is given to housing every year. You know, we have bonds, which that's great when we have it, but it runs out. We had redevelopment agencies that we actually dissolved in 2011. And the reason for that was it was a financial tools that cities were using, and they were able to say for certain neighborhoods, they would capture the tax growth and be able to then reinvest it in the community for commercial property or residential development. The problem is Great Recession hits and suddenly the state finds itself in really financial need and they have to say, sorry, locals, we can't cover your taxes anymore. We can't backfill. for the schools and for the counties. So we're going to stop that investment, which at the time made sense, but that means California lost $1 billion that was generated annually for affordable housing. And we unfortunately have not made it up. So not only do we have development problems in terms of some of the barriers that exist, we also lack actual and sustained investment. Next slide. So those are some of the challenges. So, and then to make matters worse, as you probably know, we have the fires, which are climate change driven. And so we're experiencing floods, droughts, fires. It's really bringing home how we need to look at land use and the land that is available for us to continue to grow as a state, right? And so all of these things are coming to a head, and we started to see some big consequences in about 2016. That's when we started to see homelessness. We started to really experiencing the professional class not be able to afford to rent. And so that's really what caused the states to kind of scratch their head and say, we need to do something, or the status quo is not working. Next slide. So one of the big issues in California is that until recently, all of the local land use decisions have been made by the locals. That's how California ran. And now there's a big fight between local control versus Sacramento. And part of the issue is, as our way of developing, as the way we concentrate jobs, the reality is we are a commuter state. You have people that commute 2 hours just one way to get to their jobs. And it tends to be people that are, of lesser means. And so the reality is our current reliance on single family zoning is really impacting poor people. We're asking them to do the long commutes and pay for the gas and make sure, and basically get into communities that do not have the same amenities as others. They might not have access to public transportation, parks, good schools. And so that's really the reality of the housing crisis in California. And so when you're asking a family member to drive one way, 2 hours, because they basically have to drive until they can afford housing, that's not sustainable. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is completely reshuffling the culture in California. And that means actually undoing some of the policies that we've gotten very used to. When you think about the American dream, you think about owning a house, the white picket fence. And I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm just saying, how do we actually make that dream more available to more people? How do we make sure that we have a diversified housing stock so that it can accommodate the different needs that families have? If you want an apartment, you should be able to have an apartment, and not just where you can afford it, but an apartment wherever you want to live, talking about community. And you should be able to, if you want to live in a townhome, if you want to live in a single family home, you should be able to do that in California. We can't right now. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to change. So this has created a big tension between local government and state government. State government coming in and saying, locals, you're not doing enough. We, Sacramento, are going to tell you what to do. So you can see why that can become a little problematic, and how there's been a lot of pushback at the local level from a lot of residents. And the reality is, you equate home ownership with people that vote. They tend to have the power. The problem that we have discovered in California is that, hey, if you own a home, great, that's good for you. You also like the status quo. You want things to stay the same, right? And so how do we actually create a policy that can allow for more people to have access to adequate housing? I think COVID has made it really clear and has highlighted a lot of disparities and inequities that exist. If you don't have good housing, you also can't stay safe when you're being asked to shelter in place. So it really has highlighted how important housing is when it comes to the variety of policies that we have. Next slide. So this, all of what I'm talking about has been really informing some of the conversations at the state level in California. So in 2017, when things really came more to a head, there's a couple of pieces of legislation that passed. Next slide, please. Governor Brown had been originally criticized for not caring enough about housing. He, as many of you probably have read, he cared a lot about climate change. But when it came to housing, was not something he was actually a big championing of until his second term. in 2017, he signed about 15 different bills that really started to systemically get at the problem of housing. And that was really kind of relooking at some of the zoning policies that we have in the state. So a couple of things happened. SB2, which is was a really big piece, and it was a hard piece, it was a hard politically lift, but it actually created a sustainable funding source for the state of California. Now, it's not 1 billion, but it actually is in any given year, there is a fee that is assessed on some documents, and it basically is able to generate anywhere from 200 to 300 million annually, given any year. So it's, again, not 1 billion, but hey, we're getting there. And hopefully if our state economy stays strong, we can be able to make additional investments. But that was one piece. The other one that actually was a big win for California YIMBY was SB 35. SB 35 basically tells local governments they cannot deny especially affordable projects if they have not been able to meet their own community needs of housing. And it has been a big tool for development when it comes to affordable housing. Again, you can't say no. You have to have a legitimate reason for saying no. You can't just say, I don't want an apartment building next to me. So Sacramento has really started to challenge some of the notions of local control. And SB 35 has been challenged by local jurisdictions saying, you can't tell me what to do. Thankfully, the court has said, no, actually it's a statewide problem. It's a regional impact. Sacramento can't tell you what to do. So building off of that success, in 2017, at the statewide level, people had realized what an important problem housing was, but it hadn't really percolated down to the mainstream. That really started to happen more in 2018 and 2019. And suddenly when a lot of homeowners started to realize, wait a minute, I could lose my ability to go to my city council and tell them, no, I don't want that project next to me. You really started to have more of the other side of the argument, which is no in my backyard. So now you have a bit of two sides in Sacramento talking to their legislator. You have California YIMBY, yes in my backyard, and no in my backyard. And so that really is kind of highlights the political dynamics that are happening in Sacramento. So next slide. So SB 9, some of you might have read about it. It was one of the bigger policies that we got done in this legislative cycle. And SB 9 really gives more power and authority to homeowners. The idea behind SB 9 is if your grandparents were fortunate enough to buy a home in California, and at the time they probably maybe bought a 1/4 acre, they had a young family, that made a lot of sense. Now they're getting older, they don't need that much land, but they want to stay in their home. They want to stay in their original home. So what can they do? So SB 9 gives them the ability to do two things. You can either A, ministerially subdivide your lot and sell off half of it, or you can add a duplex on it. And there's a lot of requirements in the law. You cannot, at the end of the day, if you decide you want to subdivide your lot and build a duplex, the law limits you. You can only have a total of 4 units, right? So the original building plus 3 more. SB 9 comes off of the success that California has had creating ADU law or creating more ADUs, because we've actually over the last couple of years have made it easier to build. To give you an example, in LA, they actually have been able to produce 10,000 units. And that's in just 1 year. And so ADU law, we are starting to realize that what we call gentle density, everybody was up in arms when ADUs became really popular in California. And then they started to realize, oh, wait a minute, they're kind of cute. It doesn't really change the character of the neighborhood. I'm okay with it. So now everybody's okay with ADUs. And at the beginning, they fought them. So we're hoping that SB 9 will do the same thing. We're trying to make sure people are more comfortable with duplex, triplex, and fourplex. I know, a little shocking, right? But the idea is we don't need to necessarily densify when you think of like cities as New York or even San Francisco. What we're saying is we can provide additional housing stock if we do it gently. So we just need to say yes to it. So maybe instead of having a quarter lot, now you divide it in half and you can have 2 families, 3 families living on there. And the idea of it is by allowing homeowners to do this, they can either build property for family members, they can help build intergenerational wealth. They can also make sure that they are able to supply additional housing for families. And the reality is, if you have a duplex, it has, under the law, it has to at least be a minimum of 1,200 square feet. The reason for that is because we think in California that if you actually build smaller, you can by design make it a little more affordable, right? If you're buying a house at 3,000 square feet, that's going to be more costly. So the idea is SB 9 is not the perfect solution. We know that. It's the beginning. It's one of the tools that can be used. And by making it a little more affordable for people, you help people stay within the community they want to live in, and you stop them from going further into areas that are, yes, might be cheaper to develop, but it's also creating some of the problems that we have with, we have this perpetual cycle where we worry about climate change, but at the same time, we keep telling everybody, go out further, drive longer. And so those policies are not sustainable. So one of the things that we are also realizing in California is when you actually look at some of the policies, they continue to exacerbate inequalities. And so we're trying to break that cycle. So how do we do that? How do we make it easier for people to rent, but also to buy, to be able that in 20 years, they've made an investment. But right now with the status quo, we can't do that. So those are some of the changes. SB 9 is one of those tools that we're hoping to see used. Hopefully in a couple of years, we'll have a little more data and be able to say, this is the right policy and this is the type of policy that we should be thinking about. So instead of forcing people to move into very forested areas because that's all they can afford, we think about infill and we think about building more sustainably in communities and give people access. The other thing with SB 9 is it basically unlocks areas of the state that up until now have been exclusionary. You have a lot of communities that actually have not grown. And part of it is because they get to say no. And so this gives a homeowner, as long as certain things are met, you cannot be in sensitive, environmental sensitive areas. You cannot use the provisions of SB 9 more than once. You cannot displace tenants. You cannot demolish more than 25% of the structures. Like you have all of these guardrails. You also have to by affidavit certify that if, for example, you subdivide your lot, you're not gonna move out. And part of it is people are concerned that SB 9 would be used as a tool to have investors come in and buy communities and completely transform them. There's a lot of language in the bill to try to prevent that from happening. Not to say that it will, because you can never account for every single scenario, but there are a lot of protections that are built in. The idea is to provide access to communities that right now have been saying no to the rest of California. So that is one of the things that we've been working on. Next slide. So politically, it was a very difficult bill. And part of the thing is in California, as much as we say, yes, we have a housing crisis, you see it when you basically go out. We have been actually increasing in homelessness numbers. And also because when wildfires happen, they displace people. We've lost more than 4 million acres of land. We actually continue to lose structures to fires. And just to give you kind of a quick overview, there's about 2 million homes in high wildfire areas. So the problem is going to keep getting worse because we can't stop the fires overnight. So how do we actually make it easier for people to come back into areas that are safe? So we had a lot of op-eds going out. We had a lot of editorial boards talking about SB 9 and why it was important to move forward. We had a lot of illustrations and really trying to inform the public. But even then, it's the reality when it comes to housing and transforming culture in California, it's going to take a while to get people to be comfortable with this, right? I mean, if you look at ADU law, it was first put in place 10 years ago. It's just now, we're now seeing the benefits and people are finally saying, oh, I'm okay with it. So we're hoping that we're going to see that same type of change, but it's a cultural shift. Next slide. So at the end of the day, if California really wants to reach its climate goals and transportation goals, address the housing crisis, we have to stop looking at these in silos. They all are interrelated. And so we can't get to our climate change without addressing our housing policy. And so one of the things I feel very hopeful right now, because there is a desire and a political willingness, as hard as it has been, to basically change and really reimagine how our policy, how our state can continue to grow if we integrate these policies. So next slide, please. So that's it. Thank you. I hope I was able to tell you a little bit of California. And by the way, we're always taking new people, so please come on in. Don't let the fires, the drought dissuade you.
Well, and thank you, Graciela. And I know she has to jump out a little bit early. So,
good.
oh, you're good. Okay. But if you want to take down her contact information, we're going to run short on time for questions. So thank you for including that. And next, we're going to hear from Chris Conklin from Unite Us.
Is it all right if I go kind of there? You can fire up the slides real quick. Am I the last person before lunch? Are you sure? Okay, I'll hold this then. All right, so as long as I'm not the last person before lunch, we're doing all right. So nice to meet y'all. Chris Conklin, Vice President of Unite Us. So why is Unite Us a SaaS platform that connects social care, talking to everybody in the housing experts here in the room? Well, for us, it's the dependent and independent variables to the total well-being for individuals, right? We know if someone is getting connected to care, whatever that variable in their own community is, we have to be connected, right, as groups, whether you're housing, food, transportation, that's our mindset, right? Everything you need, right, in your community, whether it's there, it's a spiritual center, it can be a stand-up boys and girls program. That's the mindset of how we think about connecting health and social care. Next slide, please. By the way, I practiced with my 1-year-old daughter and she said I did great last night. So the bar is real high today, all right? So really quickly, so when we talk about end-to-end social care, what does that mean, right? When we think about patients, what they go through, the services that they're seeking, what does that look like for healthcare providers, for government agencies, for housing agencies, for all these organizations that are already in a community and have been doing this with people for every day, right? You've been doing this for hundreds of years. There's these community health navigators that are fighting through the inefficiencies of a fragmented service delivery. So for us, we took this perfect petri dish. We started in the veteran community about 9 years ago. Our co-founder broke his leg and his back. He was an infantry officer. I served with him. He broke his back and then through his medical discharge realized, great, I have VA benefits. What does that mean? Where do I go from here? I got no job. I don't know where to go. I don't know who to talk to, right? He leaves and gets into Philadelphia and understands it is the perfect petri dish to understand how do you navigate resources, right? We don't even know where to go, who to talk to. Is it a neighbor? Is it someone you trust? That mindset about how you move through a fragmented service delivery pushed him to say, what if I created a directory? Like no one's ever done that before. And so when he first rolled out Unite Us, it was a directory. It was somewhere to go, an address, a phone number, what you believed is an accurate resource. And what happened to the veterans he was trying to connect services to? They said, this is terrible. You are sending me to someone that is not there. The volunteer didn't answer the door. The capacity, at capacity, how do you maintain a network, right? How do you maintain and bring an entire accountable network of structure and social infrastructure to the table, right? And so for us, it's technology plus people on ground and leveraging the community in the place and those resources currently available. So for instance, when you put the patient in the middle of this circle and say, do we need to identify needs? Maybe that's the piece that does it for you. Screenings, maybe they've already identified the need. What if I just need to connect them to a resource? What if there was a platform that you could log into and send a referral to an organization that actually went to someone at that organization, and you know a local team is working with that person, right, from Unite Us inside their community to make sure that their information is accurate, that they're answering the referrals, that they're pushing people through those cracks of that fragmented service delivery, but they're also making your workflow, right, important inside the platform, built to what you need to do. That was the mindset behind how we first identify, then execute a referral, but then more importantly, what happens to all this data? How do you want to drive legislation? How do you want to think about the co-occurring, the service delivery of this? How do we break down that mindset? So when we think about the patient, and their story is being told and collected, their eligibility criteria is captured, and you send them out to these services. They're able to see that story and then say, I can just provide a service. So that patient doesn't have to relive their story. We look at that service delivery, and that's that model when we talk about end-to-end social care. Now, people in the probably room are like, well, I don't care about predictive analytics. Okay, great. Can you send a referral to a community-based organization down the street? Can they send you a referral? Are there wraparound services connected to housing? If they walk into your organization, how do you know that family's okay? Maybe they just need a bicycle to get to work. Those are the type of mindsets when we talk about infrastructure, it's all of the above. It's not recreating. It's leveraging what we have and talking together and working together, and then create a governance structure that makes an end-to-end social care structure work together, right, with housing, because typically that is the number one variable outside of a job that is going to lead. Our top three needs really are housing, food, and then the third one, depending on the neighborhood you live in, is it can be the variable on the X factor. So next slide, please. So we have the platform to send and receive, but more importantly, interoperability. There's all these great resources out here. Mr. Poole talked about another one. So you have all these resources working in tandem. Well, what if you integrated into all of these as well? So then you go into eligibility screening, executing them straight into a platform that also can do all these other issues. So it's not just us standing in a silo. We have to work with organizations like his and others that are doing these to create this support system, these wraparound services to do that. So when I show the screen, it's much more than a platform, right? It sounds great to log in and do this, but this mindset allows us to collect the data, allows us to access what patients need, families, individuals. And this also brings the other silos to the table: healthcare, legislation, government organizations. That mindset to create these braided funding streams allows us to have sustainable solutions, and it just doesn't get put on housing or philanthropic dollars that we know we're fighting for every single day. Next slide, please. So on the tech side, for those that are interested in it, how does it have to work for each silo, right? Maybe it's HMIS, right? Do we have to integrate into WellSky? So when you do your workflow, there's single sign-on. So when you connect a patient to whatever service, does it get reported back into your current workflow? That's something that we have to think about, but the patient never has to see, or that family or that individual, right? That client doesn't have to do that, but we owe the community that. And then we bring in the larger players, typically who have the bigger budgets. When we talk about government, these organizations being able to work with you in the community directly with you, we can start driving these conversations on impact, capacity, but there has to be a common taxonomy to speak. We have to be talking in the same data sets because these are real people suffering from real needs, but we need to match that. Next slide, please. By the way, I'm moving fast because I know lunch is coming up. So really, the most important piece I want to really talk about on the takeaway, technology is great. What we realize, technology will not be the silver bullet for us, right? There has to be a human-to-human connection around someone's navigating their community and care. So for us, our largest investment was not our technology, even though it can be expensive and we'll go toe-to-toe with anybody, but the biggest piece was our 400+ members across the nation, our community engagement managers that we hire local from within these communities, like Linda, our state director here for Unite Nevada. They're working with these organizations and trust building exercises. There's hundreds of organizations and coalitions that have been doing this for 100 years. So why is it different now? It's not different now. These are the same conversations about how we need to work together. And sometimes it's getting over geopolitics, budgets, where financial funding comes from, but it allows us as a group to have great conversations on how we drive that. And I think when you look at a boots on ground model, matching it with technology, what do you find? People don't fall out of the system. When it works that one time, that first time, they are bought in, right? It's the same thing for the users. And guess what the hardest part about this is? Every community-based organization, all these organizations, their funding changes daily. Their volunteers quit. How do you maintain an accountable network to support people, to send them to these organizations when that changes every day? It's because you need people on ground. You need a bought-in community, and it takes everybody at the table to do it. I will tell you, Unite Us is not the problem solver. It is a thought partner to help foster these conversations because we don't own any of it. The community already owns it. And again, and the best part about it is we're all passionate. If you've lived the fragile, fragmented system of delivery, whether it be housing, it could be transportation, it could be these different models, we all have to think about how our workflows affect the one person we're trying to help the most. And I think that's what the passion and drive behind Unite Us with our boots on ground model because to maintain that, it's hard, right? To have 400 or 500 people across the nation working with these organizations, it's critical. But it allows us to accept and hear your feedback, your workflows, and then put them into a platform that actually makes sense and gives you the option to run your show. Next slide, please. Okay, so really quickly, 2 use cases. So what happens with funding when you start actually doing this? So for instance, to give you some use cases, on the same platform we're doing this, we redistributed CARES Act funding into St. Louis, right? We wanted to build around rental assistance, create capacity for housing. So how do we have performance budgeting around housing? I think when you look at closed outcomes for these referrals, when we talk about closed outcome, if someone got connected to short-term housing, temporary housing, et cetera, how much did that cost? What system can prove that? So if we can prove that and then attach dollars to it, so we can start looking at our long-term budgets. And if we're paying for services, which most of us are, whether it's on the healthcare side or others, we can look at this entire longitudinal journey and then create legislation and data around it. But again, it allows us to help distribute funding, having another system, having United Ways and other organizations not have to log into 4 or 5 platforms, right? We know platform fatigue is an issue, but again, when we can attach dollars to this journey and show how we're helping people, that's what help us can drive into this ARPA conversations, CARES Act funding, so we don't dump 5-10 million to a community and walk away. We can be smart about these conversations and do a lot of great things. Next slide, please. So really quickly to show you how that looks, right? So if someone were to log in, send a referral to a housing agency or rental assistance, that provider, that organization, whatever that may be, that helps that someone receives that information over the platform. They're able to say and report out the exact detailed structured outcome of what happens. And then more importantly, as soon as they close it out, it kicks off a reimbursement cycle for that organization to get paid for what they did, right? When we talk about sustainable capacity, that's what we're thinking about for housing, but also for all these other organizations that are providing these services. Next slide, please. We can go one more just to go a little bit quicker so everybody can. All right, so on the other side, right? Work spend time for these organizations. Does this save them time? Is it another something that they have to log into? All those conversations are real, right? Does it actually save that administrator at that housing agency less time to do their job? I think we think about all those things. Again, I'm not saying we solve it for every housing agency, but it has to be real conversations about why you use a platform. Next slide. All right. So really quickly, there's some different opportunities in the platform to do all sorts of different things. But the key element here is this whole longitudinal journey for a patient, what you can do in this platform. There's pieces that make sense and there's pieces that don't for the audience. So like understanding that you can go in and use that one piece for you is what's important to us. It doesn't have to be the whole show. It doesn't have to be all the capabilities of the system. We want to give the option to the community. Next slide. So my last slide, then I'm going to leave it here. I'll turn it over. So all this data, for those that love data, love numbers, I'm more of a people person myself, but when I think about this, if I can tell you how long it takes someone to get housing by race, gender, anything else, by zip code, and how long it takes them to do it from a service delivery aspect, or talk about the total co-occurring needs of those populations and understand that within 1 mile of their house, they have all of these resources that they never even knew about, even though it was in their backyard. When we start having those conversations, that's what we're pulling from the platform with these detailed structured outcomes. It's not just where they're showing up and asking for help. And again, that could be a barbershop that has access to Unite Us. They go to their barber, they get triaged, then they send a referral to a spiritual center. That whole journey of how that happens, we need to be able to report it. And so that's our biggest goal, is not just to give a great workflow or work production and time spend, but what happens with this and how do we do this as a group and a collective to solve issues, right? Whether it be financing, building capacity in communities, or driving legislation. So I'll leave it on that. If there's questions, great, I'm here. I'm cutting a little short because I know we're pressed on time, but thank you for your time. And I hope that gave a great representation of Unite Us.
So thank you all. Please join me in thanking our panelists too for all the great information they provided.
So we were going to kind of start moving people around for lunch and then have everyone come back for a little video visit. But I think we'll do that now so that there won't be any interruptions once lunch begins. So actually joining us right now on Zoom live from DC is Congresswoman Susie Lee, a tireless Nevada advocate who's going to give us a few minutes of her time.
Hi, everyone. Good to see you, Christine. Can you hear me? We all good? All right, great. I just walked in and got finished voting. So happy to be here with all of you. And I want to thank the wonderful team at the Nevada Housing Coalition for helping facilitate what a timely and remarkable event and affording me the opportunity to play a small part. Also, I want to recognize Ray Lathrop for emceeing the conference, as well as the rest of the planning team for creating truly a phenomenal lineup of panels and speakers for all of you. I know that you all have had or going to have the opportunity to hear from Governor Steve Sisolak, my colleague, Congressman Stephen Horsford, and have been exploring the role that data, policies, community building, and affordable housing tools can play in this prolonged fight. And no state is more in it in this fight than the state of Nevada. This afternoon, you'll be hearing about the great work of so many in our state, such as housing authorities, affordable housing finance experts, affordable home ownership and supportive housing efforts, and what solutions and capacity building opportunities lie ahead. We all know that we are at the stage that we must, the time is now to overhaul Nevada's housing landscape. And the theme for this year's conference is so fitting, housing is. And for me, housing is two things. First and foremost, housing is community. As many of you know, my career prior to serving in Congress was predominantly in the nonprofit space. And there are not many arenas where community shines through more than in the nonprofit world, and where we see the role that affordable housing plays. You know, the nonprofit space is one where the difficulty of community work is seen day in and day out, but also where we have the opportunity really to make the real change that is needed, and where we can pilot programs and bring forth real solutions for all Nevadans. And that is true in a lot of spaces, but most importantly in housing. And while the COVID-19 pandemic has been incredibly difficult on our communities, it has also allowed us to shine the light on so many of the helpers in the very best part of our states, where folks came together, worked day in and day out to make sure that their fellow Nevadans had their needs fulfilled. And it was important for me and my colleagues in Congress to fight for the American Rescue Plan to get so many needed funds into our state. And while that was just one step, the longer road lies ahead. And it's been so heartening to witness and at times firsthand be a part of Treasurer Conine's 75-day listening tour to hear the rhetoric of the housing needs, but also some community solutions that have been floated to help us deal with that. And as I found in my nonprofit work, and I see every single day in Congress, everyone's voice matters. And in Nevada, we stand today, right now, in this important moment at the intersection of opportunity and history. And the amount of money that has entered our state is unprecedented, and the continued work of the Biden administration through the American Jobs Plan Act to invest in retrofitting, to eliminate exclusionary zoning, to invest in the upgrading of home energy systems, and to improve public housing infrastructure across the United States, to me is truly an opportunity that I know we all will take advantage of in Nevada. But beyond housing being community, for me, it really is about being, it's about opportunity. And it's the foundation upon so much of our work, especially in the nonprofit space, begins. And as the former leader working with communities and schools, and also through my time in Congress, we know firsthand that housing leads to better health outcomes, which I've thought to further improve through legislation such as my Mobile Health Care Act, which would help Nevada's federally qualified community health centers expand their reach and bring primary health care to Nevadans. Housing also provides stability for children that leads to the success in the education arena. And we know this firsthand. And so if a student does not have a stable roof over their head, food in their belly, clothes on their back, we cannot expect them to be focused and to succeed. And so I hope each of you come away today from this conference with a renewed spirit about what housing is, but more importantly, how we can continue to work together and have progress here in our state. And along the way, I hope you'll all continue to see me as an ally and a partner in your ongoing work. So have a wonderful conference. Thank you so much for including me, and I'll turn it back to you, Christine.
All right, thank you so much, Congresswoman. That was wonderful to hear straight from DC. We are gonna break for lunch now, no more delay. We are gonna come back together and the panels are gonna start immediately at 1:15. So we're not going to come back into this room unless you wanna stay here for the affordable housing finance panel. The other panel around housing authorities will be in the other building, and we'll start both of those at 1:15. Thank you so much. Enjoy lunch.